Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Long mentioned, my name is Yvette Kelly, and I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I'm going to be your presenter for today. Just to provide you with some background about myself before we move into the presentation, I'm a licensed mental health counselor with over 25 years of experience of working with children and families. I've served in a variety of roles, including clinician, supervisor, quality improvement coordinator, and director of children's mental health. Most of these experiences included working with families in their homes and communities, and today's presentation is going to incorporate some of that information learned while working in the field. Just to preview how we're going to spend our time today, we will start by reviewing some key elements of out-of-office experiences along with core principles. We'll move on to looking at assessing and intervening in context. We'll review some staffing, training, and supervision needs for this type of work. We'll discuss boundaries, confidentiality, and safety, and then lastly talk about preparing for visits out in the community. Again, after today's presentation, we will have time for a brief question and answer period. So just a reminder that if you have questions along the way, then please submit them utilizing the chat box feature. And again, just to reiterate that if you have any technical difficulties during today's presentation, please chat to the host and she should be able to assist you. Okay. So with the recent expansion of health and behavioral health services in New York State, it's not a mystery why there is such a renewed focus on serving individuals in their homes and other natural community-based settings. So working with individuals out of the office is just a mechanism by which direct support and interventions are provided to individuals in less formal settings. Serving individuals in the community may include meeting someone at their doorstep or at their school. Perhaps they're more comfortable meeting at their church, a local coffee shop, or another community setting in which they feel comfortable. But no matter the setting in which services are delivered, out-of-office visits can be a valuable strategy to support individuals and improve their overall health and development. So there are a number of special opportunities offered by community-based services in comparison to those services which occur in office. When meeting in a familiar environment, individuals are more likely to feel relaxed, comfortable, and feel like they have a sense of control. This generally increases the provider's ability to connect with the individual, allowing that individual to be more engaged in their care. It also provides the potential to meet important members of the individual's family, their friends, community folks, who are generally unlikely to attend sessions that take place in an office. Providers are also able to gather a firsthand view of the individual's living situation, so you can see the neighborhoods in which they live. You can see what their home or community environment looks like, as well as observe individual culture as it manifests itself in food and icons and music and pictures and et cetera. So there is a pretty rich environment that happens when you're working with folks out in the community. It also allows the opportunity to really see the world through the lens of the individual and gain an understanding of again, the community in which they live, the people in that environment. You get to understand individual boundaries, and it helps in viewing and understanding the individual within the context of their natural environment. And one of the most important things, I believe, is that it allows for the display of the strength and resiliency factors that you can't really understand when working in an office setting. And again, as I mentioned, I spend a lot of time doing some community-based work, and so throughout this presentation, I'll just take time to share some examples to kind of highlight some of the concepts that I'm talking about. And for this, there was one example that during one of my many experiences in the field, I was working with a parent team of two small children who was on her own and struggling financially. She struggled with providing for her children, and part of my role really was to help her toward self-sufficiency while monitoring the health and safety of the children in the home. One day when I arrived to the home, it was a hot summer day, I noticed that she didn't have a refrigerator. And as you can imagine, that is important when you have two small children around. But it was really significant because she had small children and she needed a place to store the children's milk. And when I inquired about this as an issue, she politely took me to the bathroom, opened up the tank on the back of the toilet, and explained that this is where she was storing the milk because it was cold. And so I share that as an example because it wasn't necessarily how I would have stored my baby's milk, but it worked. And it also displayed how creative she was in being ordered to ensure her and her children's needs were being met. To her, it was survival, but to me, it showed great resiliency and strength that I would have not had the opportunity to see if I had not been working with her, if I had been working with her in a more formal setting. And so, again, there really are a number of advantages when you're working in a community with folks that really has them in their own environment. And again, things that are not necessarily readily available for you to see or things that you would have to really kind of pull for in an office, a more structured setting, really comes to life in the community. So aside from a number of relational and clinical advantages, there are also some financial benefits when meeting with individuals in their homes and communities. Some of this, it may prevent higher levels of care by dealing with problems before crises arise. So the ability to kind of, again, address those concerns earlier. And it may prevent the onset or the worsening of behavioral or physical health symptoms by intervening earlier. There are many times that while meeting with individuals in the community, you're able to spot a concern that requires further assessment and or intervention and take action instead of letting, that family or that individual kind of go down the road where the symptoms are getting worse. In conjunction with telemedicine and telehealth and telemental health, doing community-based visits can provide an effective and low-cost treatment option. And it also has the ability to assist with engagement issues, potentially leading to a reduction of no-show rates and thus increased productivity. And so I do want to say, of course, you need to weigh the benefits against the cost of providing these services in the community. Potentially, there are some financial benefits that could be received from doing this work. Now, there are a number of reasons why it may be beneficial to work with people outside the confines of a more structured setting. However, the decision to deliver services in the community should be considered based on the needs of individuals served. Some considerations may include whether the individual's life circumstances may prevent them from participating in a more office-based setting, the individual's inability and means of getting to the office, the impact that has on service delivery, the desire for individuals to engage other natural supports in their care, and the inability to bring all of those interested parties together for an office visit, and whether an individual lives in a rural community and would not otherwise be able to participate in the service because of that. And sometimes an individual might derive special benefit from a community-based service provided in the community as key information related to the service provision. So an example of this might be perhaps a child or an individual who's struggling with some social skills, and while they can report that to you in the office, if you're able to get out in the community and see how they're relating to others, that offers much more valuable information and helps you really kind of tailor your intervention. By just having that additional information. So that's an example. And for some, culturally, the home is much more an acceptable venue for mental health interventions than office-based settings. When delivering services either in the office or in the community, there are some principles that should be at the core of your work. First and foremost, no intervention is going to be successful if you don't take the time to develop a relationship of mutual understanding and respect with the individuals you'll be working in partnership with. Visits should always be planned, identified in the treatment plan, and determined again to best meet the needs of the individual. A person-centered approach should be utilized and the plan tailored based on the individual's capabilities, goals, and priorities. It's also important to recognize that the quality of the interaction is much more important than the number of visits per se, meaning that every visit should have a purpose. So while the frequency of visits may be determined by rule and policy, every visit has a purpose that should be established ahead of time. Home and community-based interventions require clinical oversight. However, staff conducting home and community-based visits do not need to be clinicians, and I think that's an important piece to understand. So when I'm talking about service delivery in a field that is really open to a number of different types of providers, and again, while they require some clinical oversight, the person delivering those services do not necessarily need to be clinicians. It's also important to remember that you're a visitor in someone's home, and so you need to be respectful of that. Again, you want to treat everyone with courtesy, kindness, and respect. You want to be respectful of people's personal space. And often when you are visiting with someone out in their context, you want to make sure to ask permission before just assuming things are okay for you to do. You also want to be clear about your roles and responsibilities. You want to help the individual understand how they can get the most out of this experience, and so it helps to establish some ground rules for a successful working relationship with them. And lastly, you want to be knowledgeable about your agency policies and procedures. So you want to know, again, what is required on your end, on your agencies, and when you are out in the community. There's a number of things that you'll need to consider when you're working out in the community. You want to make sure that you're in line with all of your agency policies. Next, we're going to move on to assessing and intervening in context. Some of the advantages noted earlier will be the same advantages noted here, and that will allow providers to quickly assess the needs of individuals and tailor the necessary interventions. So as I mentioned earlier, an out-of-office visit can be a strategic intervention and not only one necessitated by the individual's inability to come into the office. When providers are working with individuals within the community, it gives the provider an expanded opportunity, again, to become familiar with the individual on their turf. Providers also have the ability to personally assess issues such as safety, transportation, communal supports, and honestly, things that individuals may think are trivial and therefore not worth reporting, but may have an impact on their well-being. Again, I'll provide you with another example. So while working with an individual who was struggling financially and was at the risk of becoming homeless, I was working with this individual to secure stable housing, which included a lesson about budgeting and finances. While visiting the home one evening, there was a knock on the door. It was the local pizza delivery guy. His presence led me to question the individual about the frequency in which the family ordered out. She told me that it was quite often, and in fact, she had ran up a tab, resulting in a substantial portion of her income going to the pizza guy. And to me, that was significant. Not significant to her, but to me it was, and really helped inform my intervention. It also spoke to the impact that this habit had on the individual's health, as she was significantly obese. And so when you think about the scenario and the information that was utilized from that interaction, there was a lot there for me to work with in terms of how I can utilize that information in the assessment of this family. So I could immediately say there were difficulty with managing finances, leading to unstable housing, at times for her own children. Her own eating habits contributed to her health ailments, her obesity and diabetes, and also her inability to work. These habits were also contributing to her children's obesity. And I could also say that, well, good for her. She was able to forge a good relationship with the pizza guy because he allowed her to run up about a $500 tab at any one time. And so you got to have kind of the ability to have a good relationship, at least with some, to be for that pizza guy, the local pizza delivery guy, to be able to work with her. And so while that is just a very brief example, those are just some of the rich information that is available when you're working in context in the community. And what I find is there's always a lot of information there. You just have to use it. And so it really does help when you are trying to, again, assess a family and gather a lot of data, and especially in our time today where we like to move very quickly, it does really offer you that opportunity to take all of that stuff in and be able to kind of give an assessment without having to necessarily pull for all of that information. And I think that's very valuable. It's, again, one of the many advantages when it comes to helping and supporting an individual in their natural setting is the ability to provide in vivo exposure, making it easier for skills to be generalized to their natural environments. Additionally, interventions can be tailored as the provider can utilize information around routines to support individuals and family members in incorporating strategies in their everyday life. So when discussing potential intervention strategies, and considerations can be given as to whether or not the strategy is functionally relevant to the individual's life. Is it easy or is it doable for the individual? So it does provide a little bit more information in terms of how you may be able to intervene or what strategies may or may not work in the context of that individual. Okay, next we're going to move on to talking about staffing, training, and supervision. And so prior to the delivery of services in more natural settings, it's important to think about the staffing, training, and supervision that will be necessary to support quality service provision in the field. Supervisors and managers play central roles in building the capacity of providers to conduct quality visits. Advancing knowledge and skills in this area requires a combination of guidance on expectations, training, monitoring, coaching, reflection, and ongoing support. So some might believe that delivering community-based services is no big deal, and you can just replicate what your plans were for the office and transfer that to the community setting. However, there is a uniqueness of community-based work that requires you to be a bit more creative, a bit more flexible, and unbothered by the unstable nature of working in non-structured settings. And working in these types of settings requires special training and ongoing support. Given the ambiguity and uncertainty of the work, new employees need to be oriented not only to agency policies, but also to the complexities of working in the field as well. Supervisors need to ensure that they are frequently assessing an employee's capacity to plan, to be planful, to promote individual engagement, to employ culturally responsive practices, and to monitor safety during visits. Additionally, supervisors need to work to increase the capacity of the provider to think quickly and respond appropriately to new, unusual, and surprising situations, demands, and occurrences. Again, working in the community does lend itself to being a bit more unstable in terms of the things that providers will experience. And so that's going to be some important skills to help them kind of understand how to navigate doing community-based work. Supervisors also need to support the employee in identifying individual strengths and ways to partner with those being served. They need to work to reframe concerns and view situations from a more positive or empowering perspective, or a more strengths-based perspective, in which the provider works with an individual to tap into some of their inner sources of strength. They need to encourage employees to express concerns and talk through plans for upcoming visits. Sometimes as newer employees join the field, it's very helpful to have supervisors kind of walk through what is going to be the plan when the new employee goes and meets with a family in any community-based setting. What's going to be, how are they going to introduce themselves? what are going to be the focus of the session, how they're going to wrap up. So doing a little bit of that pre-work is very helpful. They should also be encouraged to role-play difficult conversations so that the provider becomes more comfortable managing difficult situations. Let me say that you'll never quite be able to, identify all the situations that a particular staff member would be subject to by being out in the field, but definitely helping them role-play some of those more difficult situations really begins to build up their repertoire of behavior for responding, and so that's going to be important. And many supervisors can only get a true picture of how an employee conducts a visit in the home or community by accompanying them. And while I know that this may be a management challenge, there are definitely many advantages to observing and supporting employees in the field, even if it happens infrequently, even if it's just once a year or once every 6 months, but definitely would encourage you to do it more. But that's an invaluable experience in terms of how that individual is working in the community with others. And just to remember that while I understand time is always of the essence and always an issue in terms of making sure that we have enough time to provide the right supervision and training, that the lack of training could put both the employee and those served in harm's way. And so you always want to make sure that when you're sending people out in the field that you're really preparing them for this type of work. In part because you want them to have some longevity in the field, and that is just going to contribute to that. It's also important to understand that some people are just not well suited for this type of work, and whenever possible should be screened out. Screening should focus on the worker's capacity to think on their feet, to deal with complex interactions, to manage crises effectively, be flexible, and have the ability to work in very diverse environments. Types of individuals who may not be well suited for this role are providers who perhaps have difficulties working with individuals that have different values and morals than they do. Providers who struggle with maintaining a successful working relationship with others when they strongly disagree with the individual's choices or behaviors. Providers who avoid visits due to concerns related to like cleanliness of homes or discomfort driving in certain rural or urban areas. Providers who are really rigid in terms of their time, really organized, really can't operate outside of the box, or they're really timid, meaning that, it's very frightful for them to be in some of these unfamiliar places. And providers who have difficulty accepting responsibility for their behavior. On the contrary to that, the individuals who may be well suited for this type of role include individuals who have great self-awareness and insight to their own behaviors, providers who are able to be flexible and be a little bit more creative, think a little bit more outside the box. Those who are calm, secured, and self-assured, those are great characteristics to have. You always want providers who are open to learning from others, because in this line of work, that the families are always teaching providers as well as providers teaching families. So it really is a two-way street. And the ability to adapt to new situations quickly. I spoke about this earlier, and I'll keep kind of saying it because it is one of the kind of hallmarks of working out in the field, is that it can be pretty unstable, and not necessarily unstable in a negative way, but there is a lot of change that that you have to anticipate and work around when you're in the field. And those providers are able to take more of a strengths-based approach. You can imagine that while working out in many of these settings, there's going to be a lot to contend with, and so you want someone who's able to kind of work through that and come out really with a positive attitude, which will be helpful not only for themselves but for those they're serving. I also would like to point out that most providers have the capacity to do this type of work. They have the capacity with the proper supervision, training, support, and guidance. The question really becomes more around whether or not the provider is willing. So again, I say this to say that there are many providers out there. Perhaps they're in a position where they need to gain a little bit more skill before going out in the field, but they have the capability and they have the willingness to do that. And usually those two things are great. Supervision, you have to work with them on training them and supporting them while they're out in the field as they're gaining new knowledge and gaining new skills. But again, most of the providers have the capacity to do this type of work. Supervision, as always, requires the continuous assessment of whether an employee is a good fit for this unique or challenging type of job. There are things that potentially could happen in someone's life that perhaps at that point in time, it's not well suited for them to be working out in the community. And so you only know that through your continual assessment. Again, the supervisory relationship should be supportive and collaborative in nature. And when this happens, then that relationship role models how staff interact with others. So that's going to be important. And given the demands of this type of work, it's essential that supervisors engage in regular debriefing with employees, especially when significant events occur. I think it's important to note that sometimes incidences of significance are not necessarily related to concerns with a family. For example, while on a visit in a community, there was an incident that resulted in some police involvement. While neither myself or the individual I was working with were at risk, so they were, it wasn't in our particular place where we were meeting, but it was in the neighborhood. We were required to remain in the home for several hours until the area was cleared. And so that being said, I couldn't leave the home for it was about 4 hours that day, and so I had a lot of opportunity to interact with the individual I was working with, but sometimes that's what happens, right? So it wasn't necessarily something that impacted myself or the individual I was working with, but we were subject to having to, wait it out until the area got cleared. And so those are important incidents where you want to make sure you're talking with your staff and debriefing around some of those things, because again, it can impact people's ability to do other things. So, while I'm stuck there for 4 hours, I clearly can't go see the rest of my clientele that I had for the remainder of the day because of this incident. Now, that doesn't happen often, and that might be a pretty extreme example, but just to kind of reiterate that again is some of the unstable nature of working in the field, but being able to be flexible and kind of change my course is going to be important. And that supervisors consistently challenge the views of employees through being an active listener and engaging in thoughtful questioning and dialogue. And again, this can be bidirectional. This is not one direction. Supervisors very well learn a lot from their staff, and the staff learn a lot from the supervisor as well. So those are all important pieces around supervision. Problems can arise when providers exceed the limits of their level of competency and or outside the job that they were hired to do. So as a supervisor, you want to make sure that employees are acting within the scope of their practice, what they've been hired to do. And when a situation arises that is beyond one's expertise, it's important to know that what referral and resources are available. And opportunities for individuals to engage in personal and professional development is important. It provides the provider with the opportunity to learn new skills. Again, as they're out in the field, things are always changing, always need to be working on refining ourselves, improving our practice. And so that's going to be important. And I know, again, I'll mention this time and time again, that sometimes time is a concern and an issue, but I think I think if you put the time in on the front end, it definitely will pay dividends on the back end. And as the direct service professional, it's important that you engage in self-care on a regular basis. So working in this field is challenging, and longevity in the field will require active engagement in activities that support your health and mental health. and supervisors can support by encouraging and monitoring their employees' self-care and really kind of actively focusing on burnout prevention, and even more so when folks are working out in the community than when they're office-based. And it's for those reasons I've said several times, just in terms of their noting, like that they're being out of such stable nature. And lastly, supervision is also the place to discuss hot button issues or those issues that serve as triggers. So we all have issues that push our buttons. We all do. We don't come to the field without those. It's important to know that, that it's important to kind of keep them in check. And so your hot button will get pushed at some point, and it's just a matter of when and by whom. And so you have to just be very mindful. Hopefully you guys can hear me now. We're working through some of that stuff. I would be lying if I didn't admit that as a minority, I wasn't triggered when I needed to provide services to an individual who admittedly was a racist. And so that is something that you would need to bring back to supervision and think and talk through, because, again, it won't be the only time that happens. Next, we're going to move into talking about boundaries and confidentiality and safety. So conducting services outside of the office lends itself to a number of questions surrounding, again, boundaries, confidentiality, and safety. And so we're just going to kind of briefly walk through some of those topics and talk about how that relates to doing work outside in the community and discussing a number of concerns related to those. So essentially, one of the things I like this little quote. I'm sorry, I moved the slide. When we're talking about boundaries, it is really the framework within which the provider and the client relationship occurs. So essentially, having clear boundaries is what makes the relationship professional and makes it safe for those being served. Boundaries can be seen as the invisible line between a personal relationship and a professional relationship. And the very nature of what we do, being in people's homes and communities and forming relationships and showing compassion, makes setting and maintaining boundaries sometimes a bit challenging. Given this, out-of-office visits present a more complex set of boundaries and problems, and the problem is that the boundaries are not always clear. So it's a unique setting that lends itself to being, again, unpredictable, and this requires more flexibility from providers, per se, than if they were in an office environment. And so some of the challenges is that sometimes, because of that, providers can be viewed not only as a worker or clinician, per se, but also as a guest or friend, which could lead to some role confusion. And so providers will need to learn how to navigate things such as appearing too informal or too standoffish, and striking a balance between somewhere. Those we work with are often curious about the provider and often ask provider personal questions, which tends to be more common in less formal settings. And so providers need to consider how much information they disclose. So remember that some disclosure is necessary and important in forming a trusting relationship, but it's not an equal level of sharing just by the nature of the provider role. And so to that end, you do have to give a little of yourself so that the individual understands who you are and can relate to you, and you guys can form that relationship. However, they're not your friend, and so you shouldn't really be talking to them in that type of capacity where you're giving them all of your personal information. That's why it is a very fine balance. However, when you're out in the community, some of that can be tested. And so it's important for providers to have very clear boundaries around these things. It's often appropriate to dress more casually. If you're out in the field, you're going to be doing a number of things, so you might dress more casually. And it's important to understand that providers' intentional or unintentional or planned or unplanned conscious or unconscious responses to certain occurrence, those will be very telling for people, especially, there may be some things that may not necessarily come up in a more controlled environment, but when you're out in the field, it does. For example, if you enter a residence and you're alerted to the fact that there are bed bugs, or if when out in the community you come across syringes on a playground. So how you respond to these occurrences will give those you work with some great insight about who you are. And so providers need to be mindful of that. If you arrive to the visit in your own personal car, that could be of interest to the clients, and they can derive certain things about you based on your car. So perhaps you might have a baby seat in the car, and so they now recognize that you have children if you hadn't shared that with them. Or if you arrive in a very, expensive car, then they will make some judgments about how much, they think that you are of means, or if you arrive in a very inexpensive car. So, just to be mindful that we are people in context, and so when you're out and about and working in the field, that you just have to be very mindful that just as much as you're learning about the individuals you're working with, they're also learning about you as well. There's also this issue around time when working in the community. Some questions you should be asking yourself: what's going to be the length of the session? But do you account for the time that it takes for you to be welcomed by the individual? So if you're meeting them out in the community, what is that timeline? What happens if you can't start the session on time due to a number of distractions? How will you address disruption? And how will you address crisis situations? So these are, again, all things that folks who are working out in the field already, you will know this, you would have experienced this, but definitely being able to kind of think through some of these things before it happens. What providers may find is that the time of the beginning and end of the session may not be fully under the control of the provider, and it may be difficult to kind of exercise that full control of your time. And this is going to be, critical, especially if you have a number of visits that you must meet in a particular day, and, depending on the travel time to and from, but you'll really have to find a way to meet in the middle when it comes to being able to manage this time while out in the community. It's also understanding issues around receiving gifts. This is also a topic that comes up quite frequently. Determining how to respond to gifts is a challenging area, as refusing a gift can be insulting. It can diminish the trust and damage the therapeutic alliance. So while providers need to exercise caution, some consideration may be given for the acceptance of some gifts, such as a drawing or a craft from an individual. But again, I think in the community it is a bit more different. Sometimes you arrive to people's homes and, they would like to offer you a variety of things. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's little trinkets, sometimes, so you have to be very mindful of that and think about how you're going to be able to address that in the community with folks without insulting people and harming your therapeutic relationship. When discussing out-of-home, out-of-office experiences, one of the most frequently cited concerns is this issue around confidentiality. And so the goal here is to really work with individuals where they're most comfortable. In this includes a lot of different environments. Again, it could be someone's home, but it could also be a local coffee shop, someone's porch, someone's backyard. So it could be anywhere. And so the concern in all of these situations is that the relationship between the provider and the individual will be revealed to other people in the community without the knowledge or consent or control of either the provider or the individual. And so this is why community-based work presents a number of challenges to the privacy of communications, right? So sometimes when you arrive to the visit, neighbors, friends, and others may be present or drop by during a session, or if you're meeting in a coffee shop, that's kind of an open area. So folks who are, visiting the shop may be in earshot of what you're saying. And so really this is an issue that comes up. And so, or when you arrive, family members may invite others who are not known to you to join the session, thus making them privy to confidential information. And so it's important to know that while these additional people are present at the session, obviously you have to get the person's permission at that moment in time. This will be probably less formal than it is formal because of the nature of being out in the field. But even so, these types of situations really stretches the concept of privacy and confidentiality beyond the traditional view. So these are just all great things to consider and bring back to your agencies and talk with your supervisors around, how does this impact our work with the individual? And if you've done community work before, you know that it's not always easy to decide who to include in the visit, especially as people are coming and going. Again, when you arrive, there may be several people who are already there, or there may be others who are dropping in during the session. And so I think the important piece is that the provider must take care to prepare the individual for this reality and discuss how and when communications are to take place. So issues around compromises of the individual's confidentiality is managed better when addressed in advance. So it's helpful to be thinking in advance in terms of how to address these issues. Perhaps when you meet with the family or individual for the first time and you're out in a community setting, it may be a topic that you want to touch upon briefly to see what would be helpful for the client. And lastly, one of the biggest concerns that arise around confidentiality is around the storing, retrieval, and maintenance of records while you're out in the field, while you're working out in the field. And while electronic health records may have made it a bit easier to access information remotely, but it generally comes with a substantial investment in infrastructure. So the key to keeping confidential information safe is the ability to limit unauthorized access. That being said, safeguards need to be put in place for providers who travel with original case files. So perhaps carrying around the files in a locked container and preferably out of view of others. If you're going to be using mobile devices to access confidential information, they should be encrypted in case they're lost or stolen. And there should also be clear policies and procedures in place for when information is breached. That's going to be important when you're working and managing field records out in the field. I want to move through some safety considerations because this almost inevitably comes up when we talk about work in the field, and so there's just some general tips that I think it would be helpful to offer in this context. So working in the community, providers will need to be alert to personal safety because it's likely that you will go into some unfamiliar or risky neighborhoods per se. You may be entering locations in which not all of the members welcome you. And there are just some practical steps that you can take to increase your safety. Of course, you should always have a plan to check in with others that really details your schedule, where you're going to be, when you're going to leave, just in case anything comes up, not only for your own safety, but of course, if there was a family emergency and people are trying to reach you, that information would be helpful as well. You should always carry a cell phone and ensure the phone is fully charged. Be mindful of the coverage areas. So in the event you're working in an area with no cell phone coverage, you'll need to make a contingency plan in case an emergency arises. So you don't want to be trying to find that out when an issue comes up and you realize you have no cell phone service. So those are just some general things to consider. If you drive, keep your car in good repair with full gas tank while you're doing this work. Park your car so you can head out easily and quickly if necessary. So, for example, you may not want to park in someone's driveway to avoid the possibility of being blocked in when you need to leave. You want to lock your car door before going into the visit, and if you carry any confidential records in your car, you want to secure these in a locked box in your trunk. And you only want to carry what you'll need for the day. So if you have any particular valuables, it's probably best to leave them at home, but if you can't, then minimally you should leave them in your car in the trunk. And so those are just some kind of safety considerations with that. And while working in the field, it's important that you're your most important safety resource, and that is your own intuition. So you should always remember to put your own safety first, even if it means canceling an appointment and rescheduling for another time. So sometimes you will walk into a situation where you will just know it is not a good day and time to meet for whatever reason. The best thing for you to do is to acknowledge that, to pay attention to that, and then reschedule the visit, right? And then perhaps you can have a conversation about why it was necessary to reschedule that visit in the future. And lastly, I just want to talk about preparing for your first visit. So there's some things that you should do as you prepare to go work in the community. One of the first things is that your first visit establishes the tone for your ongoing relationship with an individual. And so it's important that it's worth some advanced thought in terms of, how you're going to introduce yourself and meet with the family. It sends an important message of respect when you arrive on time, so you should definitely be timely. You want to approach the home whatever way is customary in that community. If you're announcing yourself in an earshot of neighbors, I would say use your name, not the agency's name, to preserve the individual's privacy. But please make sure that you have agency identification. Each provider hopes the individual will remember the appointment, that they will be at home and welcome them. However, an experienced provider who's done this work knows that is not always the case. And so while some individuals will have urgent reasons for not being home when the provider arrives for their appointment, some may use it as a technique to avoid having to deal with you or make changes. And so you want to pay close attention to that dynamic and address any barriers that may come up. If you're going to be doing any physical activity, you want to wear clothes that will be appropriate and suitable for what you're going to be engaging in. And again, we'll go back to that engaging. So engaging the individual is an integral part of any visit. So activities conducted during the visit should be really structured to keep the family engaged and involved. Again, they should have a clear purpose, and the provider should be able to identify that purpose and be prepared to articulate that purpose to the individual. And again, this should be a conversation, a partnership between the provider and the individual being served. And preparing for the visit includes planning how to accomplish the purpose, right? Who needs to be there, so who needs to be a part of the visit, topics to discuss, and any issues that may arise. Regardless of the purpose of the visit, safety, permanence, and well-being should be assessed or reassessed at every visit. Providers should conclude visits with summary statements and plans for next steps. So you should let them know, here's what we worked on today, here's the plan, here's how we're going to move forward, here's when I'll see you next. And preparation, again, also includes planning for worker safety, so making decisions around perhaps which staff should be present at a visit, or deciding if the visit should occur elsewhere, or should occur in a different part of the community. So those are things when you're preparing for the first visit or things you should be considering. Ongoing assessment is an important tool for keeping ongoing visits productive and focused on the individual's goals. Remember to look beneath the surface to see if there are any other concerns that is impacting the individual's ability to meet their goals. This will happen frequently. Again, sometimes individuals may find that things are not, it could be that they just find things aren't worth reporting, or, you know, there's other things on their mind and they're just not really able to answer questions around some of these things. But you want to keep your, you know, eyes surprised. You want to always, when you're, I think that's one thing, when you're out in the community, you are always needing to be alert. And so that's going to be important. And again, there's a host of information that you can be using to help in the assessment and intervention of working with families. You want to determine what other resources or supports are needed for their continued progress. And again, as I said, always continuing to address barriers to engagement. And so with that, I just want to say there's, we're going to move on to our question and answer period. I know that there was a lot of information presented, and I'm just going to just remind folks that if you have any questions, to please chat them into the chat box. And if you give me a minute, I'll be right back and see if there's some questions I can answer. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple questions. And again, just a reminder, if you have any more, please feel free to send them in. So the question is around whether or not a supervisor is supportive of the perspective of the employee and how to go about conducting visits. I think, again, there's a second part to this question. Hold on. From the employee's vantage point, how would you approach creating a more collaborative relationship with a supervisor? So it seems like there's some disagreement around how this employee is going to go out in the field and work with particular families. And so the question is, how can you kind of work with your supervisor as well to make a collaborative relationship? And so I would say to that it's worth having a conversation with the supervisor around what are your challenges, what are your struggles, and what are you hoping to achieve, and see if you guys can come to some agreement about what might be most successful. Sometimes it's, you know, sometimes the supervisor may not understand the employee's point of view, and sometimes the employee may not understand the supervisor's point of view. But I think overall it is really important for a supervisor and employee to get on the same page. And it's for those reasons I noted throughout this presentation. This is really hard work. There may be some things that come up in the course of treatment that you're going to need to be able to debrief about, to talk about, to come up with some strategies about. And so it is going to be important that you have a really heart-to-heart conversation with your supervisor if you feel like your relationship is not in the place that you want it to be in, to really determine how it is that you guys can better work together and how they can support your work in the community. So the question is, there's another question around who provides clinical oversight to case managers. I'm not sure. I'm sure that will differ from it would differ by agency. And so maybe if there's a little bit more clarity that you have for that question, I'll be happy to answer it. But if you could just chat it back in. So I would assume that people providing clinical oversight to case managers would depend on the agency and the makeup of the agency and who they have in terms of licensed staff. But again, as I mentioned in the presentation, while these services require clinical oversight, meaning someone has to be looking at the services, making sure that they're necessary, you know, developing the goals and the objectives in collaboration with the family, with other service providers, the person delivering the service does not necessarily need to be a clinician. So there's another question here around, are there any trainings offered on how to stay safe while doing community work? There are a number, I at least know of a couple of trainings that are offered that talks about safety in the field. I believe one is offered by the Office of Mental Health. There is another one that is offered from just a consultant in the community. And so if people are interested in information related to that, we definitely can send that information out to folks who may be interested. So if you just want to chat that in and let us know. So there are, I would say that there are a couple. There are not a ton of them, but there are a couple, like I said, in that I'm aware of that might be helpful. So I'm going to just give it a few more minutes to see if there's any more questions. We do have a couple more minutes if folks have questions that they'd like to send my way. And if not, then we will close out the webinar. But I do want to give folks a couple more minutes. So I'll just do that and be on mute. And if I see any questions, I'll be back to answer them. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I also just do want to say that there are some resources that are offered, and when the slides get posted, you will have access to these resources. And so, again, it's some resources that really talk about working out of the office and some of the challenges associated with that, and then, some advantages of that. So you might want to take a look at that. And then also, there's just a number of upcoming events that we're hosting, and so we just wanted to make you aware. So here are the titles and times and dates of those future offerings. So if you have an opportunity, register for the subsequent events. It looks like I do have a couple other questions coming in, and so I'm just going to take a moment because we have about 3 minutes left. But there's a question around how these services are billable, and I would say that there are a number of community-based services that are now allowed to be billed through Medicaid. That allows you to go out in the community and work with children and families and other individuals. And so there's some of this work, depending on what it is, of course, that could be billable through those new services that are available through Medicaid. So this question around, can I say more about overcoming cultural challenges, a person or family that only wants to work with someone of a particular gender or religion? Yeah, so I think that is a challenge, and I think that is something that as a provider in the community, you will definitely need to work through. I mentioned my experience of having to work as a minority person, having to work with someone who is admittedly racist, and that was definitely a challenge and a struggle. And just because he was a racist did not give me a task to not work with the family. And so I really kind of had to talk through my process in terms of being able to serve that family at the best capacity possible. And so I think that's like a lot, you have to gain some self-awareness around that. You have to have an opportunity to debrief with people, to actually work through some of the feelings that I was having as I was, I would consider myself subject to having to work with this individual. And so I think that's, I think it's just a matter of really having good supervision, good peers, the ability to kind of change mid-course and to address any concerns that come up. In the case in which I worked with the individual who was racist, there was no, and I would say my supervisor was great during this time, there was no decision that they would move me from that particular case because this person was a racist. It was more like, how can we work with this person, and can we move this person in a direction that is more positive? And so, again, it was a struggle for me, but with great supervision, I was able to navigate through it. And by the end of that relationship, we had gained some mutual understanding. And I think that was kind of the best thing out of all of the work that I did with that particular family. And so I got time. It is 1 o'clock now, but there is one more question I will take quickly. It says, how do you decide what is appropriate and professional to share about your own life with a client? Oh, yeah, that's a fine and delicate balance. And again, it's one of those things that you want to, in order for the person to get to know you, you cannot remain masked. You do have to give a little bit of yourself. But how much you give is really indicative of whether or not the information that you're giving is for your benefit or for the client's benefit, for the individual's benefit. So it may be helpful, for example, it may be helpful to tell an individual that you're working with that you're a parent, because you're going to be able to relate to that individual on that level. And so you might want to, you want them to know that. You want them to know that you can probably pull from those experiences to be able to help them. There are other things that are going to offer no therapeutic benefit if the individual, if you tell the individual, and those are the things that you don't necessarily need to disclose. All right. And since we're out of time, I do want to thank all of you who joined me today. If you have any, again, questions or want some additional information, you can feel free to reach out to us. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.